There is a trial transcript buried inside the Louisiana State Archives, one that courthouse officials in Iberville Parish quietly reclassified sometime around 1901 as administrative waste. The document runs to over 400 handwritten pages. It concerns a woman whose name does not appear in any plantation ledger, any church registry, or any county census between the years 1845 and 1869. Not a single record acknowledges her existence during those 24 years. And yet, when the trial finally began in the autumn of 1869, 23 people, freedmen, former overseers, a parish judge, and 2 members of one of Louisiana's most respected Creole families, all testified under oath about the same woman. They described the same face, the same voice, the same specific gestures. A woman who, according to every official record of Magnolia Crest Plantation, had never existed at all. Make it any safer. Historians who have examined the surviving fragments of that transcript have described the experience as deeply unsettling, not because of what was said, but because of what every witness conspicuously refused to say. In 400 pages of sworn testimony, not one person volunteered her name. They said asterisk, she asterisk and asterisk, her asterisk and asterisk, the woman asterisk and asterisk, her asterisk. That we don't say. When the presiding judge finally demanded that a witness speak her name aloud, the man, a freedman named Amos Paycard, who had worked the cane fields for 30 years, looked down at his hands for a long moment before saying quietly, "I don't believe saying it in a courthouse will make it any safer, Judge. I truly don't." The trial concluded without a formal verdict. Before its witnesses died music within 2 years of testifying. The woman at the center of it all was never found. Before we continue with the story of Magnolia Crest and the woman whose name nobody would speak, if you've never been to this channel before, welcome. Here at Liturgy of Fear, we go deep into the forgotten corners of American history, the stories that got buried, reclassified, or simply never told. If this is your kind of content, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss one. Direct answer, Mr. And drop a comment right now telling us where you're listening from. What state, what city cannot sign this? We love knowing who's gathered around this particular fire. Now, let's go back to Louisiana. It was the kind of autumn that only exists in the lower parishes of Louisiana. The air still thick and warm well into October. The cane fields tasseling out golden along the river road. The Mississippi sluggish and pewter, colored under skies that couldn't decide between rain and haze. The year was 1869, and the world that had organized Magnolia Crest Plantation for the previous 4 decades was already gone, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsteady. But to understand what happened in that Iberville Parish courtroom, you have to go back much further than 1869. You have to go back to a particular Wednesday morning in March of 1845, when a woman arrived at Magnolia Crest for the first time, and the silence around her began. Magnolia Crest sat 11 miles south of Plaquemine on the west bank of the Mississippi, and it had been in the Fontineau family since 1802. By 1845, it was one of the larger sugarcane operations in Iberville Parish, not the grandest, not the wealthiest, but substantial and well-managed, with approximately 340 acres under active cultivation, and somewhere between 80 and 90 enslaved people working the land, the house, mill, and the various outbuildings that formed the plantation's small self-contained world. The Fontineau family itself occupied a particular and somewhat complicated position in Louisiana's social hierarchy. Etienne Fontineau, the patriarch, was third generation Louisiana Creole, French and Spanish ancestry, Catholic, fluent in both French and English, with the kind of careful manners and precise social calibration that Louisiana's planter class had refined over generations. His wife, Celestine Beaumont, was from a family that had come originally from St. Domingue in the 1790s, displaced music by the Haitian Revolution, and carrying with them both significant wealth and a particular kind of watchful anxiety that their descendants had never entirely shaken. The Fontineaus kept a house in New Orleans on Esplanade Avenue for the social season and retreated to Magnolia Crest for the grinding months of harvest. They had 4 children by 1845, 2 sons, Remy and Julien, 17 and 14 respectively, a daughter, Marguerite, who was 11, and a youngest boy, Theodora, who was 8 and sickly. The plantation's enslaved community had its own internal structure, as all such communities did, its own hierarchies, its own specialists, its own memory. There were people who had been at Magnolia Crest since its founding, who had worked under Etienne's father, whose grandchildren were now being born into the same fields. Among them, and the person with the most authority, both practical and social, was a man named Solomon Peard, father of the Amos Picard, who would one day refuse to speak a woman's name in court. Solomon was the plantation's chief driver, the intermediary between the Fontineau family and the enslaved workforce. He was in his mid-50s in 145, broad, shouldered, deliberate, with a face that people frequently described as impossible to read. He had a wife, Delphine, who worked in the main house as a seamstress, and 3 grown children, of whom Amos was the middle. It was Solomon Peard who first saw the woman arrive. He described it later in a private account that his son Amos preserved and that eventually found its way into the partial trial record. An ordinary enough morning, disrupted by something he couldn't immediately name. A wagon came up the river road from Plaquemine, driven by a man Solomon didn't recognize. "I recognize you," and it stopped at the far edge of the cane fields rather than coming up to the house. Solomon walked down to meet it, as was customary when supplies arrived, and found that it carried no supplies. It carried one person, a woman sitting in the wagon bed among several bundles of personal goods, watching him music approach with an expression he struggled to describe. He wrote only that she looked at him the way a person looks at something they have studied very carefully from a great distance, and are now seeing up close for the first time. She was, by Solomon's account, somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. Dark complexion, with the kind of features common to Louisiana's most mixed communities, African, French, possibly some native ancestry, or the particular blending that the lower parishes had been producing for generations. I saw what you did. She was dressed carefully, neatly, in clothes that were good quality without being fine. She carried herself with a composure that Solomon recognized as one recognizes a skill, as something learned rather than natural, the composure of a person who has decided deliberately to appeal. Composed, you may call me. She handed Solomon a folded document from inside her jacket. It was a letter on Fontineau family stationery, in Etienne Fontineau's handwriting, instructing Solomon to install the bearer in the small cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden and to extend to her the same courtesies he would to any member of the Fontineau household staff. It gave no explanation. It gave no name. Solomon read the letter twice. Then he looked at the woman. "What do we call you?" he asked. She seemed to consider the question for a moment, not as if she didn't know the answer, but as if she were deciding which answer to give. Then she said, in a French that was precisely as formal as Solomon's own, You may call me whatever is practical." He called her nothing. Nobody did, for a very long time. The cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden was small but sound. 2 rooms, a good hearth, a window that looked out over the herb beds toward the river. It had previously housed a series of the plantation's domestic workers, none of whom had stayed long. There was something about its position slightly apart from both the main house and the slave quarters, caught between 2 music worlds without belonging clearly to either, that seemed to discourage. Comfortable occupation. The woman music settled into it within a day, and she began work within 2. Nobody knew music precisely what her work was. That was the first problem. She was not assigned to any of the established roles at Magnolia Crest. Not field work, not housework, not the mill or the kitchen or the laundry. She moved through the plantation's day with music, the freedom of someone who had been told that her time was her own, and she used that time in ways that made people uncertain. She was often in the kitchen garden handling the medicinal herbs with evident expertise: chamomile, valerian, sarsaparilla, the various bitter music roots that the plantation's informal healer, an old woman named Clementine, had cultivated for decades. She was frequently seen walking the perimeter of the property in the early morning before most people were up, moving at a careful and measured pace, as if she were counting steps. She occasionally visited the mill during grinding season and stood watching the machinery with an expression of focused attention that made the mill workers deeply uncomfortable. Most remarkably, she visited the main house, not through the back entrance as domestic workers did, but through the front door. Etienne Fontineau himself opened it for her on at least 2 occasions that Solomon Music observed, and on neither occasion did Fontenot's expression suggest that this was unusual. Within the enslaved community, the uncertainty about her quickly hardened into wariness. Something that challenges everything, the wariness had several sources. The first was simply the mystery of her origin and status. She was not enslaved, that much was clear from her letter and her movements, but she was not free in the formal sense that white Louisianans recognized, and she was not Creole free of color in the way that the parish's established community of free people of color was organized. She occupied a category that had no comfortable name. The second source of wariness was more specific. Old Clementine, who had been the community's healer for 30 years and who commanded enormous respect, refused to music speak to the woman at all after their first meeting. When asked why, Clementine said only that the woman knew things she shouldn't know, and that knowing things you shouldn't know meant you had gotten them from somewhere. And Clementine didn't want to think too hard about where. The third source of wariness was Theodora. Music, Etienne Fontenot's youngest boy, 8 years old, and chronically ill, had been failing for most of his short life. The parish doctor visited regularly and prescribed the standard remedies of the era: calomel, bloodletting, various tonics, with results that ranged from minimal to actively harmful. By the spring of 1845, Celestine Fontineau had essentially resigned herself to the possibility that her youngest music child would not survive to adulthood. This was not an unusual grief for the era. Child mortality was a constant companion in antebellum Louisiana, where malaria, typhoid, and yellow fever moved through communities with an almost seasonal regularity. Within 3 months of the unnamed woman's arrival at Magnolia Crest, Theodora Fontineau began to improve. The improvement was gradual at first: slightly better color, slightly more appetite, the persistent fever that had shadowed him for 2 music years becoming intermittent rather than constant. By the end of the summer, it was undeniable. By the following spring, the boy who had spent most of his childhood confined to his room was running in the yard. The parish doctor, when confronted with this music development, could offer no explanation and prudently declined to inquire too closely into its origins. Celestine Fontineau knew the origin. She had authorized it, had in fact initiated it, though the details of that arrangement would not surface until the music trial 24 years later. She said nothing publicly. She simply watched her youngest child grow strong, and she paid whatever price had been agreed upon. And she kept her silence with the practiced discipline of a woman who understood that some arrangements require silence to survive. The knowledge they bring. The plantation's enslaved community watched Theodora's recovery with a complicated mix of emotions. The boy's improved health was objectively music good news. A sick child's death created its own particular miseries for music, the people who served the household. But the manner of his recovery troubled people. Clementine consulted privately with Solomon and told him that the woman had been using preparations she didn't recognize, plants that didn't grow in the kitchen garden, compounds that had no name in music the French or English Clementine knew. She had seen some of what the woman carried in her bundles. She would not describe it in detail. She said simply, "That woman carries knowledge from music somewhere far from here, and knowledge that travels far from its home doesn't always music arrive clean." Solomon wrote this down. He was one of the few people at Magnolia Crest who could read and write, a skill acquired through means he never fully explained. He kept a private record, not a diary exactly, more a series of observations, which he maintained throughout music, the woman's years at Magnolia Crest. It was this record preserved by his son Amos and presented in fragments at the 1,169 trial that provided the most detailed account of what happened in those years. Most of what we know about the unnamed woman comes from Solomon's careful, cautious, consistently bewildered hand. He wrote in the Summer of Music 1,845, "She has been here now 4 months. Nobody calls her anything. She does not seem to require a name. This I find more strange than anything else about her. Stranger even than what she did for the boy. A person without a name in a place like this is either very free or very trapped. I cannot determine which she is." The arrangement, if that is the right word for what existed between the unnamed woman and the Fontineau family, endured for the next 19 years. Those 19 years were not static. Louisiana and the nation moved through upheavals that transformed everything: the Mexican War, the crisis over slavery's expansion, the Compromise of 1,850, the brutal decade of the 1,850s, when the question of the Republic's survival began to feel not theoretical but immediate. And then the war itself, beginning in 1,861, tearing through the South with a violence that the men who had started it had badly failed to imagine. What must I do? Magnolia Crest experienced all of this, and the unnamed woman moved through all of it, and her position shifted in ways that were subtle but cumulative. In the early years, her role remained undefined. The healer who wasn't officially a healer, the advisor who had no official standing to advise, the woman in the cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden who was visited by the plantation mistress with a regularity that nobody commented on because commenting on it would have required acknowledging it. Have the answer. Celestine Fontineau came to the cottage on average twice a week. The visits were never announced and never explained. They lasted between 30 minutes and 2 hours. What was discussed in them, nobody knew. Delphine Peard, Solomon's wife, who worked in the main house and observed Celestine's movements carefully, noted that the mistress always arrived at the cottage with visible tension in her shoulders and jaw just as I need them, and always left with something released in her face. Struggles not exactly peace, but the particular expression of a person who has been given information they needed, even if the information was difficult. The second Fontineau son, Julian, who was 14 when the woman arrived, developed what Solomon could only describe as an obsession. By the time Julian was in his 20s, he was visiting the cottage himself less frequently than his mother, but with what appeared to be a different quality of need. Where Celestine came seeking guidance or remedy or whatever she found there, Julian came seeking something that Solomon, watching from a careful distance, identified as music understanding. Julian was the family's intellectual, restless, hungry, minded, perpetually dissatisfied with the explanations he received from the world around him. Is it done? He read voraciously. He corresponded with men in New Orleans and in France. He was the only member of the Fontineau family who had from the beginning treated the unnamed woman as someone worth engaging with directly. Thank you, asking her questions and appearing to genuinely listen to the answers. Whether this was appreciation or appropriation or something more complicated than either, Solomon could not determine, but he noted it. He wrote, Julian Fontineau treats her as if she is a library he has been given private access to. She allows this. I am not certain she allows it because she chooses to or because she has no choice. With her, these two things are sometimes difficult to separate. The eldest son, Remy, avoided the unnamed woman with a consistency so deliberate it was itself conspicuous. He was 17 when she arrived, 20 when he took a wife, 24 when he took over management of Magnolia Crest's daily operations from his aging father. By his mid-30s, he was running the plantation with efficient, organized competence, and he behaved toward the cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden as if it did not exist. He routed his movements to avoid passing it. There is music, no turning back. He did not speak the woman's name, but then nobody did, and he managed to convey through posture and eye movement and the particular physics of a man who has music, decided something that the entire matter was simply not present in his world. Solomon found this more music interesting than any other member of the family's response. A man who avoids something that carefully, he wrote, music knows exactly what he is avoiding. Then came 1853. In the summer of 1853, yellow fever came up the river from New Orleans with the season's first oppressive heat. It moved through Iberville Parish with the efficient brutality of a disease that had been doing this for decades and had optimized its methods. Magnolia Crest was not spared. By August, 11 of the plantation's enslaved people were dead. 2 of the Fontineau household staff were dead. The parish doctor had long since stopped visiting individual households and was instead doing triage at the courthouse in Plaquemine, where the bodies were accumulating faster than they could be processed. In September of 1853, Marguerite Fontineau, who had been 11 when the unnamed woman arrived and was now 19 and recently engaged to a planter's son from Pointe Coupee Parish, developed a fever. What happened over the next 3 weeks is documented in 2 sources. A letter from Celestine Fontineau to her sister in New Orleans, which survives in a private collection, and Solomon's private record. The sources agree on the basic sequence of events. Marguerite's fever was severe and progressing. The parish doctor was unavailable. Celestine Fontineau brought the unnamed woman into the main house. For 19 days, the woman did not leave Marguerite's room. She slept on a pallet on the floor, prepared her own preparations in a small brazier she had brought from the cottage, and administered them on a schedule that she kept in her head. She also, according to both sources, talked to Marguerite constantly during the worst of the fever, not the soothing murmuring of a nurse, but actual conversation, as if she were keeping the girl Tethered to consciousness by the thread of words, Marguerite lived. Her fiancé in the house down the river road did not. Honorine Fontineau, when he learned that the unnamed woman had been brought into the main house, confronted his mother with a fury that Solomon, working in the yard, could hear through the closed windows. He could not make out words, only the register and rhythm of rage. Rémy's voice low and cutting, music Celestine's higher and inflexible, the particular music of a family argument that has ancient music roots and no clean resolution. After an hour, Rémy left the house on horseback and did not return for 3 days. And you'll do know, when he came back, he said nothing about it, and the unnamed woman returned to her cottage. Marguerite recovered slowly through the autumn, and Honorine Fontineau added one more thing to the list of things he was pretending did not exist. The question of what service the unnamed woman was providing to the Fontineau family, and what she was receiving in return, became more urgent as the years went on, and the answer remained hidden. She did not age in the way that people music expected. This is a statement that requires careful unpacking, because it is easy to misread. She was not ageless in any fantastic sense. She aged, but she aged slowly, or seemed to, in ways that were difficult to account for. When Solomon first saw her in 1845, he music estimated her age at 30 to 40. When he next made a careful note of her appearance in 1858, music, he wrote that she appeared to be somewhat older than when she arrived, but not so much as 13 years would account for. By 1863, when she had music been at Magnolia Crest for 18 years, he wrote, "She is old now. We leave tonight, but old in the way a well-made thing is old worn in ways that show use, not in ways that show decay." Others noticed this. It fed the wariness. It fed something that in the quarters had by then accumulated enough weight to be called, quietly and carefully, fear. The war changed everything, and it music changed nothing, which was the particular cruelty of the Civil War in Louisiana. Union forces took New Orleans in April of 1862 and moved up river through the parishes with a speed that left the planter class scrambling. Iberville Parish fell under Union control in 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation, whatever its practical limitations, transformed the legal status of Magnolia Crest's enslaved population, and over the following months, the plantation's workforce reorganized itself with a thoroughness that left the Fontineau family's management structures largely intact, but fundamentally changed. Many left. She has not gone. Some stayed, negotiating for wages or sharecropping arrangements that would have been unimaginable a year before. Solomon Peard stayed, Delphine stayed, Amos, their son, now a man in his early 30s, stayed. The unnamed woman also stayed. This was noted. Her staying when she could have left, could have walked away into whatever music freedom meant in 1863, Louisiana struck people as significant. Solomon wrote, "She has not gone. I asked her why. She said, because I am not finished here." When I asked what she meant by finished, she did not music answer. She has never been a woman who answers questions she finds uninteresting. The Fontineau family contracted. Etienne had died in 1860 from a stroke that the parish doctor attributed to the strain of watching the Republic come apart at its seams. Celestine remained in the main house, increasingly diminished. Rémy took what remained of the family's music resources and attempted to maintain Magnolia Crest as a going agricultural operation under the new order, with limited success. The weight of this. Julien had spent the war years in New Orleans, working in some capacity for the Confederate government, and then, after the city fell, apparently making himself useful to the Union administration. in ways that his brother found unforgivable. Marguerite was in Natchitoches with her second husband. The first had died in the war's first year, and rarely wrote. It was Julian who came back first, in the spring of 1,865, and his return immediately complicated everything. Julian Fontineau was 41 years old in 1,865, and the war had done to him what it does to men who think too much about the thing they're experiencing while they're experiencing it. It had made him music certain of some things and uncertain of everything else. He came back to Magnolia Crest with a specific agenda, Solomon sensed, though the agenda revealed itself slowly. Julian spent the first weeks of his return re-establishing his relationship with the unnamed woman. He visited the cottage daily, and he brought papers and books, and seemed to be asking her questions of a more structured kind than he had in their earlier conversations. Less I'm curious about this, and more I need to understand this precisely. Solomon observed these visits without being able to hear their content, but he noted Julian's emerging effect. I will, Father. A mixture of urgency and something harder to name, not quite guilt, not quite desperation, the thing that sits between them. It was during this period that Solomon first began to suspect that the unnamed woman's position at Magnolia Crest was not what it appeared. He had long assumed that she was there by Etienne Fontenot's arrangement, that the patriarch had brought her for reasons of his own, and that Celestine's subsequent use of her services was secondary music development. But something in Julian's behavior suggested a different possibility. The quality of Julian's engagement with the woman was music, not that of a man consulting a resource his family had acquired. It was something with older obligations embedded in it, something that music predated his father's letter. Solomon wrote in the summer of 1,865, I have begun music to think that she was not brought here by old Fontenot. I have begun to think that she came here for her own reasons, and that whatever arrangement exists between her and this family, she negotiated it herself from a position of choosing, not of being chosen. If this is true, then the question of what she wanted from them, what she has been getting from them for 20 years, becomes the most important question about her, and nobody has answered it. Nobody has even asked it, at least not where I could hear. The question would be asked music soon enough, but not by Solomon, and not in any private conversation. In August of 1,866, Rémy Fontenot's eldest daughter, a girl of 16 named Honorine, disappeared. She vanished on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a working week. Between the time her mother last saw her after the noon meal and the time the household sat down to supper and noticed her absence, she was not in the house. She was not in the yard. She was not anywhere on the property that a thorough search that evening could locate. The river was dragged, the cane fields were walked, the outbuildings were checked, nothing. By the following morning, the search had extended to neighboring properties, and the river road toward Plaquemine. By the third day, the parish sheriff was involved. By the end of the first week, there was no evidence that Honorine Fontineau had left Magnolia Crest by any conventional means. No one had seen her on the road, no one had seen her on the river, and no personal items beyond the clothes she had been wearing music were missing from her room. She was never found. The investigation music that followed was cursory by any standard. Honorine was 16, female, and the parish was still in the chaos of reconstruction, with the sheriff's office understaffed and overwhelmed by cases that involved violence, not absence. The working assumption, stated or unstated, was that she had run away, to New Orleans, perhaps, or across the river to Baton Rouge, or with a young man whose name nobody knew. Rémy Fontineau refused to accept this explanation publicly and barely accepted it privately. I would not stand. His wife, a woman named Clothilda Nero, accepted nothing. I know you know where she is. She demanded answers and received none. Command the truth. It was Clothilda who first spoke the connection aloud. She said it to her husband in their bedroom, and the sound carried through the old house's walls to where Delphine Peard was working in the hallway. Clothilda said, "That woman in the cottage, that woman your mother has always gone to. I want to know what she has given that family and what she has taken in return, and I want to know now. Remy, because our daughter is gone." Remy's response, according to Delphine's account at the 1,169 trial, was a long silence followed by a single sentence, opened immediately, "We will not stand. Some things in this house you do not ask about." And Clothilda, who was a Nero and had not been raised to accept silence as an answer to anything, said, "Then God help us all, because I will find someone who will ask." She was 3 years ahead of her threat. The asking would come in 1,869 in a courthouse in Plaquemine, with a judge and a jury and 23 witnesses and 400 pages of testimony. And at the center of all of it, unchanged, unnamed, waiting, the woman in the cottage, we have presented clear evidence. The 3 years between Honorine's music disappearance in 1,866 and the trial in 1,869 were the years in which everything that had been hidden began to pressure its containers. Celestine Fontineau died in the spring of 1,867 in her sleep at the age of 71. Her death was not unexpected. She had been failing steadily for music 2 years. But its timing, coming less than a year after her granddaughter's disappearance, sharpened music certain edges. And her death also removed the last living person at Magnolia Crest, who had been present at the unnamed woman's arrival, and who had known the full terms of whatever arrangement existed. We need to talk. Etienne was dead. Celestine was dead. What do you want, Remy? The arrangement's origins were now locked inside 2 people. I need your help. I know, Julien Fontineau and the woman herself. Remy Fontineau, in the months after his mother's death, music began to do something that Solomon had not previously observed him doing. He began to ask questions. Not of the woman directly. Remy still would not approach the cottage, still routed his movements around it with the same deliberate geography he had maintained for 20 years. And everything changed. But he began to ask questions of the people around him, of Solomon, of Delphine, of the older freed people who had been at Magnolia Crest long enough to remember things. I have to know who those visitors were. He asked carefully, precisely, with the controlled effect of a man who was terrified of the answers, but more terrified of not knowing. He asked about the early years, about what the woman had done and said, about who had visited music, her and when, about what Clementine had said before she died in 1,859, about the particular music, texture of his mother's visits to the cottage. Solomon answered what he could, withheld music what he felt he should, and watched Remy Fontineau arrive over the course of music several months at a conclusion that visibly horrified him. What that conclusion was, Solomon did not record directly, but he wrote in October of 1,867, "Remy Fontineau now knows something he did not know before. I cannot say how much. I can say that it has made him frightened in a way he has never been frightened music before. Not during the war, not during the fever years, not when Honorine disappeared. A man who has spent 20 years refusing to look at something, when he finally looks at it, sees everything at once. I do not envy him this." The following month, Remy Fontineau went to Plaquemine and spoke to the parish attorney. He returned without having achieved whatever he had gone to achieve. The parish attorney, a man named Voisin, was not interested in a complaint that amounted to, "A woman of uncertain legal status has lived on my property for 22 years under an arrangement made by my deceased father without a body, may have done something to my missing daughter, and my deceased mother knew about it and never told me." Voisin reportedly pointed out that music without a body, without a witness to any specific act, and without a clearer articulation of what crime was alleged to have been committed, there was nothing the legal system of Iberville Parish could usefully do. Ramey came home, and a week later the unnamed woman came to him. This was unprecedented. In 22 years she had never come to Ramey. She had always music been the one approached, the one visited, the one sought. But on a November evening in 1867, while Ramey was working in the plantation office reviewing accounts, there was a knock at the door, and he opened it, and she was there. "I won't go." Solomon was not present for this conversation, but Ramey told him about it the following day in a state of controlled agitation that Solomon had never before observed in a man he had known his entire adult life. To stop you, the conversation, as Ramey described it, was brief. The woman had come to tell him something. Specifically, she had come to tell him that she knew he had spoken to Voisin, and she had come to tell him that if he pursued a legal remedy, things would come out that he would not find comfortable. Things about his family, things about arrangements that had been made over the years in exchange for the services rendered, things that he, Ramey, had benefited from without knowing he was benefiting, which she seemed to feel was not a mitigating circumstance. Nothing to do with what happened to Honorine. Ramey asked what she wanted. She said only what she had always had: the cottage, the freedom of movement. "Tell me where she is, Ramey." The arrangement talking about Ramey said that the arrangement had apparently included his daughter, and he would not continue any music arrangement that had included his daughter. The woman said, very quietly, that his daughter had not been part of any arrangement, that Honorine's disappearance was not something she had caused or could explain, that she understood why he thought otherwise, but that he was wrong. Ramey did not believe her. This was where things stood in early 1868, when something changed. Though Solomon was never entirely clear on what the best he could reconstruct was that Julian Fontineau, who had until this point maintained his separate relationship with the woman in what appeared to be a genuine compartmentalization from his brother's situation, reached some kind of breaking point. Mr. Font, perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was the particular honesty that comes when someone has been carrying a secret so long that the weight becomes unbearable. Perhaps the woman herself asked something of him that he was unwilling to provide. Whatever the cause, in the summer of 1868, Julian went to the parish attorney's office and made a formal statement. And the content of that statement was the detonator. "I must find." Julian Fontineau told the parish attorney that he knew the origin of the unnamed woman's arrangement with his family. He knew it because he had helped to arrange it 23 years earlier, when he was 20 years old and convinced that he was doing something clever. He told the attorney that the arrangement had been made not by his father but by himself, explained the specifics of the in his father's name, using the family's stationery and the family resources, and that what he had arranged was not what anyone who looked at it from the outside could have guessed. He said that the woman was owed a debt by the Fontineau family going back further than 1845, that the debt was of a kind that Louisiana law in 1845 had no mechanism for acknowledging, and that she had come to Magnolia Crest not because they had sought her, but because she had determined that Magnolia Crest was the place where the debt could be repaid. And she had approached Julian, then a young man in New Orleans, recently arrived at her relative's house for a social season. and she had made him understand what was owed, and what she was prepared to do about collecting it. She had, in other words, not been brought to Magnolia Crest. She had brought herself there, and Julian had opened the door. When the parish attorney asked what the debt was, Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that explaining the debt would require explaining something about his family's history in St. Domingue, where his mother's family, the Beaumonts, had come from, where they had come from, and what they had done there, and who they had done it to, and who, therefore, might have very old reasons to find them and present a reckoning. The trial was set for October of 1,869. The Iberville Parish courthouse in Plaquemine was not built for spectacle. It was a modest building, brick, 2 stories, with the self-conscious dignity of a structure that knows it represents something larger than itself. In the autumn of 1,869, it was crowded in ways it had not been built to accommodate. The bureaus mandated. The trial drew observers from 3 parishes, several journalists from New Orleans papers, and a small contingent of Freedmen's Bureau officials who had their own reasons for interest in a case that touched on questions of personhood, debt, and accountability in post-war Louisiana. The unnamed woman was present music for the trial. She sat at the front of the courtroom to the left, in the chair that had been designated for her, and she was precisely